Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Your host, Dennae Handford, will dive deep into chapter-by-chapter discussions on specifically selected books to help you make better decisions as an entrepreneur. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HandfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HandfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HandfordCapital.com.
Hello, and thanks for joining me today, Sunday, December 23rd, for our Sunday edition of the Tough Decisions podcast. This is Dennae, and I'm your host on Sundays, and we are talking about some principles of public speaking. And we're working through a book called Talk Like TED, written by Carmine Gallo, the 9 public speaking secrets of the world's top minds. And I hope so far that our discussion on this topic has been challenging to you, but also that you've gotten some practical tips, some really specific, detailed things to think about as you might be preparing for public speaking, or maybe you're just someone that has to be in front of an audience on a regular basis. It's, just part of your job. And there are things that we can incorporate into our public speaking that can eventually become habits for us, and they can make us more effective communicators. And of course, we've talked previously about how important it is that we be effective communicators, whether it's in our job or our homes or personal life. It's really important that we be able to communicate our thoughts, our ideas, in an influential way, because that's how we are able to impact people around us. Now, the first 2 tips or public speaking secrets that we discussed were, first of all, passion, and second, during that speaking, we should somehow be able to tell a story. And that's important because a story enables us to communicate in a little bit different way and allows us to get our ideas across, but also be able to connect to members of the audience that just speaking and, giving ideas and giving facts does not allow us to do. So, number 1, passion. Number 2, telling a story. Number 3, public speaking secret is have a conversation. Now, when we say have a conversation, there's some important things that we're getting at, and there's some important aspects of a conversation with an individual that should come through in our public speaking. The reason this is important is that if our body language and our gestures and our voice are not congruent with the message, then our audience quickly picks up on that. And there's noise that's created, a cacophony, if you will, that's created that interferes with the message when what we're saying is not congruent with how we say it. And Gallo actually goes to the extent of giving an analogy where he says it's kind of like having a Ferrari, a really, really great message or a great story, but not knowing how to drive. And that would be your delivery. When our delivery is not congruent with the amazing message that we have, then there's the incongruence creates noise, it creates interference, and so it hinders the communication. Now, the good news is that this also is something that we can improve. Gallo talks about practice. And, there's the saying that says, it takes 10,000 hours of practice to master a particular skill. And he uses his old friend Steve Jobs, because as you'll recall, Gallo also had written a book about Jobs, and kind of just shows the evolution of his own speaking ability and how when he was first the head of the Macintosh Corporation, his original or his first public speaking appearances, Steve Jobs was noticeably nervous, even to the point of being physically ill several times before an interview. And so he talks about that, but there was an evolution, and that didn't just happen naturally, but Jobs would spend hours and hours rehearsing and preparing and practicing. And so we can do the same thing, and that's good news. Now you say, oh, that sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but it's good news because that means it's something that we can also get better at and maybe even become a master at some point. Now, when we have a conversation, there's really 4 different aspects of that conversation in addition to the actual words that come through, and we need to be able to use them to our advantage when we're public speaking as well. Those things are our rate, or how fast or how slow we speak, our volume, how loud or how soft, our pitch, and the pauses that we use. And we do those things so naturally when we're having a conversation, when we're telling a friend a story. We incorporate all those things very naturally. What happens, though, is a lot of times we get in front of an audience and there's not that give and take back and forth because we're public speaking, and all of a sudden we don't utilize those communication tools as we should. Basically, these are the equivalent of a verbal highlighter. You know, if you ever look at a book that I've read, you're going to see lots and lots of, I usually use a pencil, so lots and lots of pencil marks, or you might see a highlighter. That's one of the reasons why I still like to use paper books. And I know you can still highlight things on, a Kindle app. I understand that. And, I listen to Audible a lot, and you can clip things out of the audio, but I still like the pencil and paper because I like to underline and star and, draw boxes around important concepts and that thing. But that's essentially what our rate and our volume and our pitch and our pauses, it helps us to highlight parts of our message that are really important. If we suddenly stop doing that just because we're speaking in front of a large audience instead of just to one person, then we lose a large portion of what enables us to communicate and to get our message across. Now, Gallo goes into some specifics, and I'm going to share just a few specifics related to each one. He talks about the pace of public speaking and what the ideal pace is. The ideal pace of conversation and the ideal pace of public speaking is a little bit different. Most of us fall, in our everyday conversation, we fall in the 175 to 195 words per minute range for conversation. When we're public speaking, the ideal rate is typically a little bit slower than that. And the reason is that there's not the give and take, and people are trying to process probably very new ideas when we're public speaking. So we typically will slow down a little bit, but we can vary that in order to emphasize things. If we're telling a story and there's a really exciting part of the story, and if we're at a moment in the story that's full of suspense, we might slow down. We might speed up at an exciting point or a high energy point. So we can vary those rates, but it should be like a conversation. And we don't want to get too far off track in order to make it awkward or to detract from the message. And Gallo mentions, that a lot of times we tend to slow down when we're public speaking, probably just because we're thinking more about what we're trying to say. We want to make sure that we pick the exact right words. But this is a reason why practice and more practice is so important when you're preparing for a big public speaking moment, because you want it to be a conversation, but you also want to have chosen the correct words, and you want to have chosen the correct way of communicating those words. You can also use pauses to emphasize, and you can change your volume up or down to emphasize. A lot of times I think we naturally raise our volume to emphasize something, but one of the things I learned while teaching is that one of the fastest ways to get people's attention is to slow down and lower your volume. And I would do this strategically in my middle school classrooms, because there would be times when the students would be excited and they would be loud and they'd be high energy. And one of the ways it happens kind of naturally. You don't have to prepare them or warn them, but one of the ways that you can get their attention is to lower your voice and slow down. And it's such a contrast to the energy that they're bringing to the table that they have to pay attention just to hear what you're saying and process what you're saying. So I think that can also be an effective way. Now, obviously, there are times to raise the volume, to raise the energy level, and we have to learn to use both of those strategically. But don't underestimate the impact of lowering the voice and pausing. And one of the other things I learned while teaching is that silence can be used very strategically in order to prompt a response or prompt some thinking. One of the things I learned while in school is, asking a question and then giving time for people to think and answer. The quiet or silence can be very unnerving when you're in front of a group, but it can be very effective because if you want a response, you need only wait a little bit. Somebody is going to break the silence. And it may feel like forever. 1 or 2 seconds can feel like an eternity if you're a young teacher, or maybe you're a young, inexperienced entrepreneur and you're trying to allow time for your audience to process. It can feel like an hour, but a few seconds can be really, really important to allow your audience to process what you've just said, especially if it's a key point that you're trying to communicate to them. So don't be afraid to use those strategic pauses and moments of silence in order to allow some time for processing of those important points. Next, Gallo talks about body language, and he's going to talk about body language and gestures and how we can use those to support and help us communicate, or how, if they're not used properly, they can, again, detract from our message and interfere with the message that we're trying to communicate. He did some work with a former FBI, CIA, and NSA trainer who talked about the way that they would train their agents to identify people who were not telling the truth. And what they realized is that body language was very, very important in knowing whether someone was telling the truth or not. In fact, it was so important that they did an experiment to sort of quantify it. And what they did was they had their agents, and they split them into 4 groups. They had their agents, some of them, listen to an audio file of an interview or an interrogation. They had some of the agents that the only thing they could do was listen to the audio file. They had other agents who all they were allowed to do was see the video of the person being interrogated. So they didn't have the audio. All they had was the video of the interrogation. They had other agents who had access to the audio and the video, and then they had a final group that had access to the audio, the video, and the case files. And what they found was that the group who had access to just the audio files of the interview or interrogation, in other words, all they could do was hear the questions and the answers, they were accurate in picking out the people who were lying 55% of the time. So with just the audio file, those agents were only able to identify people who were lying 55% of the time. The people who had access to the video, but not the audio, so they couldn't hear what was being said. All they could do was see the body language of the interrogated person. They were accurate in identifying the person lying 65% of the time. Now, with just those 2 alone, I think we could draw the conclusion and say that the body language was actually a better communicator than what was actually being said or the audio. And of course, the people who had access to both were more accurate. And the final group who had access to the audio and the video and the case files were actually accurate 93% of the time, which is more accurate than a polygraph test. So with all of those things together, they could be extremely accurate. All of that to say, when you stand up in front of an audience, you want everything that you do and say to work towards communicating the message. You don't want anything that goes on to detract from the message or to give the audience any reason to question or doubt what you're saying. And so this FBI, NSA, CIA trainer said the most important thing to make sure is in place before you speak is that you believe what you're saying. Now, Gallo has already talked about that in chapter 1, and that's passion. If you don't believe in what you're saying, then it's going to be hard to get to the point where your body language and your gestures support that message. But if you've got that taken care of in chapter 1, the passion, then fast forward to, preparing the body language, the gestures, then the practice, you can hone those other skills and make sure that what you're doing and what your body is saying is supporting that message. I want to end our episode today by discussing 3 common problems that Gallo identifies in this area of body language or gesturing. And the first one is fidgeting, tapping, or jingling. And he says this is pretty easy to identify if we will just take the step of performing this public speaking that we are preparing in front of a video camera and then watching ourselves. And if you've never done this, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It can be very enlightening, maybe a little bit embarrassing, but only in a good way, in that it makes you really stop and think about every single thing that you do. We don't realize how we look a lot of times with the things that we do. And I've done this before. I've done this in college when I was preparing to be a teacher. I've done this after college when, I was having to evaluate myself as a teacher. And since I've done it. And when you watch yourself, what you realize is that what we do can be very, very distracting. And this tapping, this jingling, these gestures that have no point, they're not just neutral, they're actually detracting from the message because they're distracting for the audience. So his suggestion is video yourself, figure out what it is that you do, because I think every person is a little different. So figure out what it is that you do with your nervous energy and then work really, really hard to eliminate those nervous gestures from your presentation. There's another problem that he identifies, and that is standing rigidly in place. So this is kind of the opposite. We're afraid that we're going to do something to detract. So in order to compensate, we don't do anything and we're just rigid. And we don't have a conversation like that. Just think about yourself when you're in your natural environment, conversing with a spouse, a child, a best friend. We don't stand rigidly and stiffly in place or, sit stiffly in place. We're naturally moving about the room, moving our arms to emphasize our points. And so standing rigidly in place can be distracting simply because it's not natural and we don't seem comfortable with our conversation, with our message. The third thing he identifies as a common problem is people having their hands in their pockets all the time. And this also may be something that we do to compensate for the nervous gestures that we want to do with when our hands are out of our pockets. But keeping the hands in the pockets does not communicate confidence and belief in what we're saying. It communicates shyness, if you will, a lack of confidence or a lack of belief in what we're saying. And so very easily, he says, just get your hands out of your pockets. One hand is acceptable as long as the other hand is moving freely and gesturing, but get your hands out of your pockets and do something, perform gestures that are natural, but that also help to communicate the message that you're trying to communicate. The last thing I want to share with you is a quote that is actually at the beginning of this chapter and then revisited at the end. What we do with our body can actually change the way we feel and think. Just like the way we think and feel comes through in the way that we carry ourselves. And this is very easy to illustrate simply by looking around and seeing the people that are natural leaders. They typically have this presence about them, and it's very easy to pick them out in the room as someone with a command presence. They feel and think like someone in charge. Those who don't, you can pick them out as well, and it's pretty typical. They a lot of times don't stand up quite as straight or quite as tall. A lot of times their presence is sort of shrinking back rather than leaning forward a little bit. So what if that is your natural way? I mean, what if you don't naturally have a command presence? Well, you can actually change the way that you think and feel by changing the way you hold your body. So it works one way, but it also works backwards. And Gallo actually quotes some research that proves this. So if you're not someone that naturally has that command presence, then work and practice on looking that way. And Gallo says, he quotes another author, but he basically says, don't fake it till you make it. Fake it till you become it. And practice that presence, practice that posturing and those gestures until that is who you are. And until it's so natural for you to have that command presence that you don't have to think about it anymore and you don't have to work on it. That will change the way you communicate. It will change the way people respond to your message, and it will change your effectiveness as a communicator. That wraps up our conversation today on having a conversation when we're public speaking. I hope it's been helpful. I hope you've gotten some practical tips from that. I want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas this coming Tuesday. I will be back with you next Sunday for the 4th public speaking secret as we work our way through the 9 public speaking secrets of the world's top minds in Talk Like TED. Next Sunday, we'll be talking about that 4th one. And I look forward to that. In the meantime, have a very Merry Christmas, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.